when I came to California, we had a sort of a semi-corrupt part-time legislature dominated by racetracks and saloons and liquor distributors, so on, and people went up and entertained the legislators with prostitutes and what have you. And I really sort of prefer that government in retrospect to the full-time legislators I have now. So I just am more skeptical about my ability to predict which reform I'm going to like the results of and which I would like to trade back in for my former evils.
Present situation, in my view, has gotten totally out of control, and incidentally totally out of sync with what the American Congress even, as well as the public, intended, because in 1907, Congress said, and it's never been changed, that corporations shall not contribute money to federal elections. And in 1947, they said the same thing about labor unions, and then they enacted campaign legislation in the early 70s, which, when later interpreted by the federal election commissions, enabled corporations and unions to do on an unlimited scale what Congress had said they shouldn't do at all. And politicians did not really understand the potential in that initially. I remember the first guy that called me, Senate candidate, called me for a soft money contribution in probably in 1985 or so, and he was kind of embarrassed about it and sort of danced around the subject of how this money was going to find its way into his campaign and everything. And he was asking me for an amount of money that was illegal under the law, except if I did it via soft money. And that has developed to the point where I have literally had people where I have firsthand knowledge of requesting $1 million contributions or larger, which would never be reported, would never be required to be reported. And I regard that as a perversion of the system.
We have an unholy mess in California in terms of electricity. And again, it reflects, I would say, a fundamental flaw in the education system of the country, that as many smart people of all kinds, utility executives, governors, legislators, journalistic leaders, they had difficulty recognizing that the most important thing with a power system is to have a surplus of capacity. Is that a very difficult concept? You know, everybody understands that if you're building a bridge, you don't want a bridge that will handle exactly 20,000 pounds and no more. You want a bridge that will handle a lot more than the maximum likely load. And that margin of safety is just enormously important in bridge building. Well, a power system is a similar thing. Now, why do all these intelligent people, ignore the single most obvious and important factor and just screw it up to a fairly well? So I'm giving you a response, which is, of course, another question. As my old professor used to say, let me know what your problem is, and I'll try and make it more difficult for you. We are especially prone to get uncomfortable around financial institutions.
We're quite sensitive to risk, in whether it's in banks, insurance companies, or in what they call GSEs here, and in the case of Freddie and Fannie. We feel there's so much about a financial institution that you don't know by looking at just figures, that if anything bothers us a little bit, we're never sure whether it's an iceberg situation or not. And that doesn't mean it is an iceberg situation in the least at banks or insurance companies that we pass. But we have seen enough of what happens with financial institutions that push one way or another, that if we get some feeling that that's going on, we just figure we'll never see it until it's too late anyway. So we bid adieu without, and wish them the best, and without any implication that they're doing anything wrong. It's just that we can't be 100% sure of the fact they're doing things that we like. And when we get to that situation, it's different than buying into a company with a product or something, or retail operation. You can spot troubles usually fairly early in those businesses. You spot troubles in financial institutions late. It's just the nature of the beast. Really?
Yeah, financial institutions tend to make us nervous when they're trying to do well. That sounds paradoxical, but that's the way it is.
Financial institutions don't get in trouble by running out of cash in most cases. Other businesses you can spot that way, but financial institution can go beyond the point, and we had banks 10 years ago that did that in mass, but they can go beyond the point of solvency even while they still have plenty of money around.
Well, Ben Franklin said if you want to be miserable, during Easter or something like that, he says borrow a lot of money to be repaid at Lent or something to that effect. And similarly, being short something, which keeps going up because somebody is promoting it in a half-crooked way and you keep losing and they call on you for more margin, it just isn't worth it to have that much irritation in your life. It isn't that hard to make money somewhere else with less irritation.
It would never work on a Berkshire scale anyway. I mean, you could never do it for the kind of money that would be necessary to do it with in order to have a real effect on Berkshire's overall value. So it's not something we think about. It's interesting, though. I mean, I've got a copy of the New York Times from the day of the Northern Pacific corner, and that was a case where two opposing each owned over 50% of the Northern Pacific Company, Northern Pacific Railroad. And when two people each own over 50% of something, it's going to be interesting. And Northern Pacific on that day went from 170 to 1,000, and it was selling for cash because you had to actually have the certificates that day rather than the normal settlement date. And on the front page of the New York Times, which incidentally sold for a penny in those days, it's had a little more inflation than Coca-Cola, front page of the New York Times, right next to the story about it, it told about a brewer in Newark, New Jersey, who had gotten a margin call that day because of this, and he jumped into a vat of hot beer and died. And that's really never appealed to me as, the ending of a financial career. And who knows, when they had a corner in Piggly Wiggly, they had a corner in Auburn Motors in the 1920s. I mean, there were corners. That was part of the game back when it was played in a kind of a footloose manner. And it did not pay to be short. Actually, during that period, you might find it interesting. In the current issue of the New Yorker, maybe one issue ago, the one that has the interesting story about Ted Turner, there's also a story about Hetty Green. And Hetty Green was one of the original incorporators of Hathaway Manufacturing, half of our Berkshire Hathaway operation, back in the 1880s. And Hetty Green was just piling up money. She was the richest woman in maybe in the world, certainly in the United States. Maybe some queen was richer abroad. But Hetty Green just made it by the slow, old-fashioned way. I doubt if Hetty was ever short anything. So as a spiritual descendant of Hetty Green, we're going to stay away from shorts at Berkshire. It's a fascinating business because there are, in this audience, there are people with hugely different propensities to have an accident. And of course, most people figure they're better than average. Now, part of the propensity to have an accident will depend on how many miles you drive. Obviously, somebody never takes the car out of the garage no matter what their driving skills might be, is not going to have an accident. If they drive 10 miles a year, you're pretty safe with almost anybody. But so there's a relationship to miles driven, but there's a relationship to all kinds of other things. And the trick in insurance is being able to figure out the variables and not have them too many, because you still have to get people to fill out a form, and you don't want something that has practically no significance. But the trick is to find out what questions you need to ask to determine in which category to place people as to their propensity to have an accident. Now, in the life insurance business,
even Charlie and I figured out that the older you get, the more likely you are to die in a given year. Now, that's not the only factor, but everybody understands that the older you are, the mortality risks go up. And they've learned a few other things. They've learned that females live longer than males. Now, that doesn't get into a judgment as to why or anything else. You just know it. So you build that in if you're pricing the product. And then you know a whole bunch of other things. You may even know that cholesterol's bad. That makes a difference in terms of predicting the mortality. But in the auto insurance business, there are lots of variables that correlate with the frequency with which a person will have an accident per mile driven. And the more experience you have with a large body of people whom you've asked a lot of questions about and can draw conclusions there from, the better off you are. State Farm has got a wonderful body of information. I mean, their actuarial judgments should be better than anybody else's because they've got more experience with more cars and drivers. But our experience with close to 5 million policyholders enables us, I think, to underwrite quite intelligently. But every day, we're looking for some variable that will tell us more. People with a good credit history are better than drivers by a significant margin than people with a lousy credit history. Why? We don't care too much why, because it wouldn't help it. What we really need to know is that the two factors correlate, and we're looking for correlations all the time, and we're trying to avoid spurious correlations, which you can have. And it's a moving target. You keep working on it all the time, but we're better at it than we were 5 years ago, and we'll be better at it 5 years from now than we are now. When we go into a new state, we will have a very small body of policyholders, and some of the factors obviously prevail over all states, but there's certain things that you learn actually only if you're in a state for a while. You're more likely to have an accident if you're everything else being equal, if you're an urban driver, city driver in a big city, than if you're driving in an area that's very rural where the density of other cars is very low. If you're the only guy in the county with a car, you're not going to have a lot of two-car accidents. So the underwriting question is all important, and fast, fair settlement of claims is very important because people who really weren't injured start feeling worse and worse as they talk to more and more lawyers. The claims delivery is a vital part of running a good property casualty operation. And all I can tell you is at GEICO that we think very hard about those things, but we'll be thinking about them tomorrow as well as today.